This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome everyone to our 4th Saturday Seminar Series. Our speaker today is Dr. Sheryl King, who retired a few years ago as Professor Emeritus and the founder and director of the Equine Science program at Southern Illinois University-Carbondale. She is a past president of the Horsemen's Council of Illinois and was on its board of directors for 30 years. Dr. King is a distinguished fellow of the Equine Science Society, an associate in the 50-Year Horse Society, and currently serves as the chair of the Best Horse Practices Summit. The author of many scientific research publications as well as general horse articles, she continues to serve the horse industry on a number of advisory boards, as well as providing leadership on legislative issues and speaking on horse management topics in more than half a dozen countries on 5 continents. We are so glad she is here today to help us discern fiction and tall tales from facts and documented science. Welcome, Dr. King.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Okay, we will.
Do I hit this share button or do you take?
Yep, no, I am throwing it over to you.
Okay, share screen. Oh, hit the share button. There we go. And go back to here. Okay, tell me if you see a full screen of the introduction.
We do.
Okay, I think we're here.
Wonderful.
So again, thank you, Jenny, for inviting me and for HAHS inviting me to speak on my favorite topic, actually. And I will apologize ahead of time if I step on any toes. I will try to do it as respectfully as possible. I could go on for a very long time about myths in the horse industry. I'm trying to hit the high points, not only talking about the myths and misinformation, but also to try to educate people on how to spot it and how to fact check it for it. So as a way of introducing it, I would like to first distinguish between some of the terms in information. There's dogma, misinformation, disinformation, and plain old folklore. So again, I hope to show you how to spot misinformation. Start thinking about when you're reading things, especially on social media and the internet, the questioning the motivations of whoever is posting it, using logic, reason, science literacy to try to sort out fact from fiction. I'm going to talk about the what, the who, the why, and the how. So the who would be people like equine crusaders is what I've called them, people that usually have some kind of agenda, be it emotional, social, political, financial, whatever. And with that, the notion of confirmation bias. Talk about the why, which a lot of times is marketing and financial gain. So creative marketing and the horse industry. How good intentions can be exploited. And then finally, I will intersperse a lot of examples along with it and talk a little bit about the placebo effect. So first comes definitions. Dogma basically is a principles or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. So basically it's usually applied to some strong belief, which the people that adhere to that belief are not willing to discuss rationally. And I think in our own brains, we can all think of examples in our life where we have dogma being introduced. Misinformation is false information that's spread regardless of whether there is an intent to mislead. So misinformation can be spread innocently. And that's different from disinformation, which is a form of propaganda. That's the intentional dissemination of false information. It's got a deliberate intent to deceive or mislead. And then finally, folklore, which any of us who have been in the horse industry for any period of time at all should be well acquainted with. It's a body of popular myth, popular beliefs relating to a particular place, activity, or group of people. And in our case, it has to do with horses, the horse industry, and horse people. So when we're talking about dogma, this is this belief as truth. It can have its place. I thought of an example of this is at I used to go to my grandmother's and visit, and she grew this patch of rhubarb in her backyard. And at the time, I loved sour things. So as a child, I would run to the backyard, snap off a stalk of rhubarb and start chewing on it. I understood, I don't know who told me, but I understood that the leaves were toxic and I could not eat them. Okay. I was told somehow that if I ate the leaves of the rhubarb plant, I would die, and I believed it. And this is what a belief system should do. It should protect a species by handing down known facts that if doubted or tried for ourselves, we would die. So there are two professionals in the horse industry whose websites and Facebook pages I follow that I particularly like. Dr. David Ramey is one of them. I don't always agree with Dr. Ramey, but I do enjoy his posts and his information. The other one, I call him the two doctors, is Dr. David Marlin, who's over in the UK. And Dr. Ramey basically says about dogma, it's always been a curious phenomenon. In the horse world, people often get dogmatic, from the best way to feed a horse to the proper way to ride, chew, groom, etc. Dogma is usually expressed in terms of things that someone should always or never do, and it's often at odds with what is known, often dramatically so. So, how do we detect false dogma, misinformation, disinformation, and harmful folklore? Basically, you have to develop your baloney detector. You have to be able to sniff out these things that are untrue, and then to be able to go back and fact check it and find out whether indeed your gut reaction to it is true and you are being fed some misinformation. Now, of all the information on the left with the bologna sandwich, there are a few of them that I particularly think are more relevant. First is, how reliable is the source of the claim? Particularly if you're looking on social media. The first thing that I do when I see something is I go to the URL and look at that, and that will give me a really good idea of whether the source of the claim is professional or whether there's something else that may be going on there, like the intent to market something. The other one is, does this fit the way the world actually works? This is the rational mind that some people, when they're on the internet, seem to dispel disbelief. But if it doesn't sound right, if it doesn't sound real, it probably isn't. Is the claimant playing by the rules of science? I guess you have to understand the rules of science, but if you understand basic biology and what they're trying to tell you doesn't hold with those basic rules of biology, then probably it's misinformation. Is the claimant providing positive evidence? If they claim that research has been done on this or studies have shown, then whenever I read a statement like that, I want something telling me where I can find that information. If it's not available, then at least there should be an easy way to go back to it using that particular source and find out where they got their backup information. And finally, are personal beliefs driving the claim? And that could be personal beliefs, or it could be something that has to do with financial gain. So those are the kind of things to keep in the back of your mind when you're trying to assess something that you see either in print or on the internet to see whether you're dealing with baloney or not. Give you some sample information and some examples of how these things get started, or examples of some of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. Well, when it comes to dogma, there is a really good example about how dogma gets established. And it just happens to do with the equine eye and how horses see, and the notion of what they call a ramped retina. So on the left side of your screen, you see a normal mammalian eyeball, okay? On the right side of the screen, you see a depiction of an eyeball as it was observed in 1914 by Eugene Nicholas, who was a researcher. Now, if you understand the way that vision occurs, I have to explain this a little bit. The light rays come across the cornea, which is on this side of the eyeball. They go directly to the retina in the back. The distance from the cornea to the retina is called the focal length. So depending on the angle of the light coming into the eye, the focal length on a completely spherical eyeball is exactly the same regardless of where the light is coming from. But if you go over and you look at this ramped retina of the horse, or the uneven eyeball, you'll notice that the length of the focal length going to the retina to the top of the eye is longer than it is to the bottom side of the eye, which got people wondering, okay? You have to understand a little bit about how focusing works in order to understand this idea of the ramped retina and horses' supposed behavioral changes because of the way their eye was shaped, okay? If you're looking at light coming from a distant source, those light rays generally are parallel to one another. They go into the eye, they hit the lens, okay? And the lens's job is to bend those light rays. It bends the light rays, hopefully, so that they all come together at a single point right at the retina. When they come together at a single point right at the retina, you can see a crisp, clear image. If you're looking at light coming from a close or a near source, the light rays are, sorry about that, I was trying to get my pointer to work. The light rays are going away from one another or dispersing. They hit the retina, which will bend the light rays, but I mean the lens, sorry. If the lens doesn't bend it enough, then those light rays are going to come at a principal focus, or the focal point is going to be well behind the retina. That doesn't mean that the light penetrates the retina and goes into the back of your head. It means that this portion of the retina is going to see a fuzzy image. So the idea is, if you're looking at something from a near source, the lens itself has to change and accommodate so that it will bend those light rays more in order for them to meet at a single point at the back of the retina. So hopefully you understand a little bit about how the lens works and how vision occurs. So now we've got this horse that has a ramped retina, that has an eyeball that is not uniformly round, and the distance those light rays have to travel is longer if the light is hitting the top of the eye versus. So Nicholas in 1914, he described this non-spherical eyeball from a dissection study. He suggested that the shape could affect refraction and vision in horses. So 30 years later, this guy called Walls hypothesized that the horse's lens itself is not very flexible. And in order for a horse to be able to focus light rays, they actually change the position of their head so that they can get the light rays to either focus at the top or the bottom of the eyeball to compensate for the fact that their lens can't accommodate very well. So this hypothesis was repeated but not confirmed through subsequent years, and it generally got accepted that the horses had a ramped retina, so it became dogma. That dogma appeared in veterinary and equine science textbooks for decades. In fact, to my chagrin, when I first started teaching equine science, I taught the idea of the ramped retina. And it was only in the 1970s that studies were actually conducted that proved the ramped retina hypothesis was absolutely wrong, that Nicholas just had a bad eyeball, he didn't prepare it correctly, and a horse's eyeball is round. Yes, their lens doesn't accommodate as well as a human does, but the dogma still lives on in the computer age. Those studies were done in 1975, and 50 years later, this is the picture that I took off of the internet from a website called Earthlight, written by Gordon Raymond, who claims to be a scientist. So you can see how it's quite easy to take misinformation and just keep re-quoting it until it becomes dogma. So first you have to understand how you can create misinformation, or if it's intentional disinformation, and make it palatable. So to make misinformation believable, the best way to do it is to sandwich it in between truth. They say the best way to lie is to mostly tell the truth and slip the lie in there. So basically what you do is you take facts and you layer the baloney in between those facts to make it seem like it all goes together. Okay, here's a really good example pulled off the internet. Okay, if you look down below here, basically it says the mane is an important factor in the horse's thermoregulation mechanism in a colder time of the year. Horses grow a thicker mane before winter, change it to a thinner one before summer, just like they change their summer and winter coat. We can see the naturally thicker and better growing manes and forelocks in the native horse breeds. Also, we see the thicker manes in pony breeds who, due to the specifics of thermoregulation mechanisms, their greater body surface to body weight ratio, they need a thicker hair layer to keep their internal body temperature in the proper range. So this is what we're looking at to try to assess our bologna sandwich. Amusing, how to amuse a professor. Okay, so let's find the bologna sandwich in this particular post. Okay. Anything I've underlined in green is true. So the mane is an important factor in a horse's thermoregulation mechanism. Horses, however, do not grow a thicker mane and tail before winter and change it to a thinner one before summer. But naturally thicker and better growing manes and forelocks do exist in native northern bred horse breeds. So this is how we've sandwiched two facts on either side of a piece of bologna to make it seem absolutely true. Then if you also layer in a little bit of pseudoscience terms or quotes from experts, it really makes it feel very legitimate. Okay. So just for clarification, yes, horses do grow sometimes No, horses don't grow thicker manes and tails in the wintertime. This is the exact same horse in the winter and the summer. Yes, some northern breeds do have naturally thicker manes and tails. If a mane looks fluffier in the winter, it's due to piloerection. Piloerection is just the erection of the hairs at the surface of the skin to fluff it up and increase the insulation that an animal needs to stay warm. Horses do shed their winter coats in the spring, but to my knowledge, only the Basker Curly breed sheds its mane and its tail in the spring. So, a little bit about how misinformation gets promoted. The best way to promote misinformation is to make it appeal to the emotions. And most misinformation is created and promoted by people who have something to gain, whether it's something emotional or ego or financial. So here's another example. I pulled off the internet. It's been making its way around the internet for quite a while now. Supposedly horses can hear a human heartbeat from 4 feet away. When in a herd, they synchronize their heartbeats. And if a horse's heart rate, it's supposed to say, goes up, they know there is danger. This is why it is commonly said that horses can sense your fear. So this misinformation certainly appeals to the emotion. Who doesn't, what human that loves horses doesn't want to feel like their heart of a horse? And when we look at the originators, Equine Giveaways is an equine themed sales site. So it's trying to grab your attention in order to get you to buy something. So when I looked back at this particular post, I found that it was originally posted on a website called Equestrian Professional, but it was posted by a private horse owner or instructor. Within 1 hour, it had gotten 43 shares. The original poster, the owner instructor, within 24 hours got 72 shares off of that. And I just did a quick scan of the internet to see where this was repeated on other internet sites, horse sites, Jumper Nation, Blackheart Equestrian, all of these different ones. And then I finally got tired and frustrated with looking. That's a few of them. Okay. The thing that got me, and should get most people, is not a single sharer searched for the original source of the information. They just hit share because it sounds cool, without knowing whether what they're sharing is truthful, factual, or not. So let's analyze this. Where's the meat? Where's the baloney? Horses can hear a human heartbeat from 4 feet away. We've been around horses. That would be very confusing if you lived in a herd and there were 20 horses within 4 feet and you heard 20 different heartbeats. The lowest volume threshold for horse hearing is about 7 decibels, about the same as for humans. Notice that this is information that is about 40 years old. We've known this. Hear somebody else's heartbeat from 4 feet away. Horse cannot either, because they can hear the same level of softness that you can. As far as synchronizing their heartbeats to either other horses or to humans, there is no published research on heartbeat synchronization between horse and herd mates. I will say that there is a group that proposes that there is such a thing and claims that there is research. But I went back to the science literature and nothing has been published on it, no science at all. Now, there are preliminary studies that have reported a link between heart rate variability between horses and humans under some circumstances. Heart rate variability is very different from heartbeat synchronization. Horses can sense your fear. This is the true part of it. Horses are very sensitive to visual cues, and they can become very uneasy when a herd mate or a human that's nearby becomes tense. We all know this. So that last part of the sentence is the grabber that a lot of horse people will say, well, yes, I absolutely know that is true. If that is true, therefore, everything that precedes this statement must be true as well. Then you can start disseminating and fabricating legitimacy on this particular piece of information or misinformation. This is a book, and I'm not picking on anybody here when I pick these out of the internet. I don't know Anne Marlene Shelton at all. I have never read this book. It might be a really great book. But on page 12, she says, horses' hearing ability is also exceptional, and research has suggested that they have the capability to hear a human heartbeat from 4 feet away. Aha. So I found this, and she did cite somebody, this Thyssen 2015. Good. Now I can go back and find Thyssen and find out where this piece of science supposedly came from. Well, Thyssen turns out to be a reporter for The Guardian. He wrote an article about horse therapy, or using horses as therapy, hippotherapy. He went back to the original misinformation that was quoted widely on the internet, and that is what ended up in Ms. Shelton's book. So you can see how you can make misinformation look quite legitimate, and it can sprout legs and gain a life of its own really quite easily. Here's another example. Can hot horses defy the law of physics? Hopefully you've seen this on the internet as well, but basically the tip has been to never turn a wet horse out to pasture, because the sun can heat the water on their body to very high temperatures and cause the horse to overheat. You should always scrape your horse off and let them dry in the shade before turning them loose. Now, your rational mind hopefully will kick in, and you can equate what they're saying here about horses with yourself. Most of us have jumped into a swimming pool on a hot day. When you jump out of the swimming pool and there is water on your body, does the sun heat it up and boil you alive? You can heat water on your horse's body to very high temperatures. Let's look at the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that heat moves from hot to cold. Okay, so heat is transferred from a hot object to a cold object. When you're talking about horses, humans, or other warm-blooded species, there's basically 4 different ways that you can get heat to move. You can use convection, which is basically air movement across a body that strips off the heat. So on a windy day, when you're in front of a fan, something like that, you can take the heat from a warm body of a horse and eject it through air movement to the atmosphere. Conduction involves the touching of 2 objects of dissimilar temperature. So if the horse is laying down on a cooler ground, for example, they will lose their body heat to the ground. And most of us have probably experienced this when we've sat down on a cold rock and our butt gets cold. Evaporation is basically when water or sweat gets evaporated from either the surface or from the respiratory passages of an animal. As we all know, horses do this extremely well because they're one of the only species that sweats over their entire body. So when that water on their body or that fluid evaporates, it takes the heat with it. And then finally, radiation, which is what the original post was talking about, radiation from the sun, which is hotter than a horse. So the heat is transmitted through the air to a cooler surface, okay? For example, if you're outside in the evening on a clear night, you'll notice even when it's warm out, you feel cooler. And believe it or not, it's because your body heat is being radiated to the cosmos, which is much, much colder than you are. And you will stay warmer if you're going outside at night on a cloudy night. Same thing. Okay, so here's some research that has been presented by Dr. Marlin about how horses cool off and how well they can do it. Basically, hotter water evaporates, cooler water draws heat out. Okay, so that's the difference between evaporation and conduction. In this particular illustration, you get a hot horse that's at 104 degrees. You cover that horse with water of the same temperature, so you're covering that horse with hot water. Evaporation occurs, and the horse's body temperature goes back down to normal from the evaporation that will end up cooling the horse. You can also take a hot horse and pour ice water on them. Okay? And through conduction, the heat leaving the horse's body into the ice water, the horse's body will cool down to normal temperature. So those are the two basic principles. Which one works the best? Well, as it turns out, conduction cools much better. And it's something that is almost counterintuitive. You take a hot horse, temperature on them, and they're actually 13 times more efficient at removing heat than if you poured ice water on a horse, which will cool it down faster, but it won't remove as much heat. If you look here, adding 104 degree water to a 104 degree horse and allowing it to evaporate will remove 2,200 kilojoules of heat. And if you pour ice water on them, you only remove 168 kilojoules. So evaporation is an extremely powerful way of ejecting heat from a horse. So if we go back to the original post, we know now that evaporative cooling occurs even when the water on the horse's body is as warm as the horse's core body temperature. And conduction from the cooler water that you're spraying on the horse and evaporation of the applied water will occur long before the radiant heat by the sun could heat any water above body temperature. So the horse will not boil. Finally comes the almost dogma in the horse world: always scrape your horse off. Scraping water off following a bath has become dogma in the horse industry, but does it make sense? So here is another myth we can try to put to bed. It's been quoted and admonished through the horse industry for a very long period of time that, you know, if you're going to wash your horse off, scrape it off before you put it outside or put it in the stall or what have you. And nobody has ever put this to the test. Finally, in 2020, actually 2019, a group of Japanese researchers did investigate the various ways to cool out a horse. Okay, so this horse, for instance, is in a treadmill. Okay, so in a very hot area, so they are overheated. The experiment was either allow the horse to walk it off with fans, so there's convection going on. Intermittent cold water, about 50 degrees, that is immediately scraped off. Cold water that's applied intermittently with no scraping and allowed to stay on the horse, and the application of continuous cool water, but notice that this water is at a much higher temperature. This is at room temperature, pretty much. So it's pretty easy to see the difference in the amount of cooling that occurs when you scrape a horse, don't scrape a horse, or just keep the water coming. Dr. Marlin also did a similar experiment because the idea of that original post was that the skin temperature was going to heat up again, possibly to really dangerous levels. So basically what he did is intermittently applied water to horses with no scraping in between. So during this cooling phase, and looked at various parts of the horse's body, their skin temperature, the temperature of the blood in the pulmonary artery, their rectal temperature, their muscle temperature. And basically what it pretty conclusively proves is that not scraping the horse does not cause the skin temperature to rise. So we have proved that you do not have to scrape a horse off, but it doesn't matter how often you repeat an untruth, it's still untrue. So once I found this little quick tip on the internet, I disproved it, and then I started looking for where it had just been shared. And some of those places was really scary. I mean, a lot of it is rather major, for instance, feed dealers, but veterinary practices, big magazines like Horse and Rider, EquiSearch are repeating this with evidently not fact checking beforehand. So my take home message on this is, even if you are reading something from what you think is a reliable, quote, scientific source, if it sounds weird, check it yourself, because they could be just sharing it without checking. As long as we're on the topic of hot horses, let's talk about a few other myths about hot horses. And I'm not necessarily picking on Curly Farm. It's just that I saw this in a convenient one-stop shopping site for curly-coated horses. It was easy. So that's basically what I did, but it's stuff that's repeated in the horse industry all the time. For instance, giving a hot, sweaty, or overheated horse very cold water to drink. Supposedly it will make them very ill, contributing to potential colic episodes, which colic is one of the leading causes of death for horses. So the thinking is that you should use tepid or lukewarm water for horses to drink and limit it to small amounts, hopefully frequently. Another one is it's a never good idea to spray a sweaty, hot, or overheated horse with cold water. You should spray them with lukewarm water to cool them down so that you won't shock their muscles and risk a severe medical condition called tying up. Tying up is not caused by heat, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. So if using cold water, the idea is to spray the lower half of the horse's legs with water for the first 5 to 10 minutes. Spraying the legs where the blood vessels are located just under the skin helps to regulate the whole horse's body temperature. And then again, spray and scrape. All right. Back when the Olympics were going to be held in Georgia, the Summer Olympics, during the middle of the summer in hot, humid Georgia, a lot of research was conducted all over the world, and including in the state of Illinois at the University of Illinois, to try to find out how horses coming over to compete in the Olympics would fare with trying to deal in a hot, humid climate. So we finally, 30 years ago, found the answer to some of these questions. What we found is unlimited access to cool water while a horse is hot will actually result in them drinking more. And you can hydrate them better if you offer them cool water rather than lukewarm water. Any of us would probably prefer, if we're really hot, to drink slightly iced water to room temperature or warm water. It's the same with the horse. We've already seen that the cooler the water, the faster the thermal transfer with conduction. But the research that was conducted relative to the Georgia Olympics found that cooling large muscle masses and concentrating on those, the rump, the shoulder, the neck, reduces core temperature faster. There is no muscles cramping because of it. And if you've ever watched a horse and looked at a horse's skin when they're very hot, you will notice that there is blood vessels near the skin all over the horse's body. So it really has nothing to do with the legs or the matter of fact, there's poorer circulation going to a horse's legs than there is going to some of the rest of their body. So what we've heard is keep the water cool, keep it coming, don't bother scraping the horse, and give them unlimited access to rehydrate themselves. I think we've got somebody outside with their microphones on. So there are several different things that are out on the market to try to help cool a horse down. And I am just going to let you use your rational brain to try to think this through. This is a company out of Australia that has invented a blanket that can be refrigerated, or it comes cool, and presumably through conduction, it is going to cool your horse off. So just think about it and do the mental exercise. You should be able to figure out whether this would be good for the horse or not. One of my favorite things as a scientist is finding people, companies, internet sites that draw conclusions using deficient or absent data. And then they invent a product or a service to fix it. And there are many examples of this. I could go on forever, but I picked a few that are out there, popular, and or you could spend a ton of money on this stuff. So one of them is on the current controversy right now on bits and breathing. I'm not picking on Dr. Cook, except that Dr. Cook, retired veterinarian that used to teach at Tufts University, does not believe in bits. And even though he retired in 1994, he's been the chair of his own company called the Bitless Bridle, and he has developed the Dr. Cook Bitless Bridle. And there is a lot of information on the internet about bits with horses and whether they're humane and what they do to breathing and how they affect horses. A lot of it is promoted by Dr. Cook. It's a perfect example to bring up the topic of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and recall information in a way that supports what we already believe. So we cherry pick things. If we see a group of facts and those facts do not dovetail exactly with what we tend to believe, we will cherry pick whatever facts are in there that tend to reinforce what we already believe. It's a human tendency that we have to be aware of and try to combat all the time. Each individual, we all have our own perceptions of reality. It's true, everybody perceives reality differently, but reality could care less about our perceptions. It does not change It is what it is. So we're going to talk about bits and bridles and bitless bridles. And it's a perfect story about how a hypothesis has turned into a crusade. You have to understand a little bit about the breathing or the upper respiratory passages of a horse. Okay. The horse breathes only through its nose. A horse is not capable of breathing through its mouth. So the air will go up its nasal passages into the nasopharynx area and down through the trachea into its lungs, while the oral cavity is completely closed off. And the oral cavity is closed off because a horse's soft palate, that soft part of the roof of the back of your mouth, extends all the way back to the back of the throat in the horse and actually hooks into the epiglottis. So the horse is physically incapable of breathing through its mouth, and it has to close off its breathing in order to swallow. Okay. So here are the two facts that we know. A horse can either breathe or it can swallow. They cannot do both at the same time. Here are a group of suppositions that are promoted by Dr. Cook. Horses swallow before they run. This creates an airtight seal that they need for running. I've seen horses with their tongues hanging out of their mouths. So how do they have an airtight seal with the tongue hanging out of their mouth? I don't know. Bit pressure breaks the lip seal, dissipates the vacuum, and the horse begins to suffocate. A bit obstructs the airway, causes turbulent airflow, increasing the work of breathing in. The bit-induced movement of the tongue and jaw disturbs airflow, and bits can stimulate salivation and swallowing. Swallowing interrupts breathing. Saliva might be inhaled, causing respiratory distress. These are all the different hypotheses that Dr. Cook has to justify the fact that bits are bad. So we've talked about the breathing passages of horses. Basically, you have the nasal cavity, you have an epiglottis here, you have arachnoid cartilages, and these two structures at the back of the horse's throat in their pharynx area hold the air passages open to the trachea, okay, under normal circumstances. When something dysfunctions in this particular area, it starts to obstruct airflow. And there's various ways that this can happen, and I'm not going to go into all the different ways, but basically they fall under the umbrella of dynamic laryngeal collapse. The area of the larynx doesn't function properly, and therefore it impedes airflow somehow. One of these is, for instance, epiglottic entrapment, which means that soft palate rises up, the epiglottis that hooks into it and holds it down comes unhooked. And even though there's still an opening, the opening is narrowed now for the horse to be able to breathe. So when the horse is moving at speed, they aren't getting enough air. Another illustration over here on the right, I hope you can see my pointer. Okay, here's your normal horse. And then this is the position you put the horse's pharynx in when you ask them to collect in their head, okay? So they're tipping their nose down. It creates more of an angle into the airway. Whenever there's an angle here, you need, and the horse is moving at speed, you need greater inspiration force to get the air moving, which creates more suction, which then pulls some of the soft tissue lining that portion of the airway into the airway. You can do that yourself. You can suck your soft palate down into your mouth if you do put negative pressure inside your mouth. It does the same thing with horses, basically. Okay, so When you're talking science, now we're going from layperson stuff on the internet to science, pseudoscience, quasi-science. So you have to understand what you're reading here a little bit. Hopefully you know what a hypothesis is, but a hypothesis is a supposition or a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited point to do further investigations. So this is one of the major articles that Dr. Cook has published and uses as his reasoning behind the fact that bits are bad in his mind. So realize this is a hypothesis article. It's a hypothetical etiological relationship between the horse's bit, its pharynx, its inability to breathe, negative pressure, and all of that kind of good stuff. Okay, so it did appear in what is supposed to be a peer-reviewed journal, but realize this is a hypothesis. When you read any scientific paper, it will immediately go to materials and methods. How was the experiment conducted? The experiment was not conducted, but the hypothesis was founded on the evidence of physics, anatomy, physiology, and one medicine. One medicine is basically holistic medicine. And at the end of most every peer-reviewed publication, you will see any possible conflicts of interest. Most researchers have to cite the source of their funding. In the case of Dr. Cook, it's his own company, the Bitless Bridle. Then when you go to the references section, which is at the end of every paper, and some of them will list a very long series of references, and this is all the background information that a scientist takes in and uses. All scientists stand on the shoulders of take what is known and then we add to it by doing experiments. Here's kind of a red flag. Anytime you look at the references, and most of the references are of the author's material, and there's very few references other than that, it's a source of concern. That doesn't mean that it's bogus material, it's a source of concern. The other source of concern is to actually start watching the language that you're reading and hearing. There's such a thing as loaded language. It's used all the time. It's used in the media now a lot. And we need to all start getting really sensitive to loaded language. That refers to words, phrases, and overall verbal and written communication designed to elicit a strong emotional response from the reader or listener. So it may not be overtly false, but they are words and phrases that are specifically chosen to get you thinking on an emotional level. In that article by Dr. Cook, these are some of the loaded words and phrases that he uses. And why do we worry about this in the horse industry? Because when you are dealing with emotional topics, particularly in a beloved animal, it can fuel various groups and movements based on something that may or may not, in this case, be true. And that's what I worry about. The growing power of animal rights activists that are campaigning against uses of the horse at all, and particularly uses of various kinds of tools that we have always used with horses. Okay. And that's not to say that we can't start evaluating all of those tools and decide which ones, just because they've been used forever, that doesn't mean they're humane. Doesn't mean they're inhumane either. Okay, so bits have been blamed for directly causing or worsening the severity of upper respiratory tract collapse. This was Dr. Cook's premise in developing his bitless bridle, but For years, there were no studies to confirm or refute this because those studies are extremely hard to do. And therefore, bit use has become a controversial welfare issue in horses. Go home and Google bits and horses, and I guarantee the top Google sites you'll come up with are mostly animal welfare and animal rights sites. Okay. So finally, in 2020, there was a controlled study, and it found that the Dr. Cook bitless bridle did not reduce or prevent dynamic laryngeal collapse. What the researchers concluded was that dynamic laryngeal collapse was mostly due to head and neck angle. And that's consistent with observations that have been made for a long time during exercising when endoscopes have been used in an exercising horse. So here is the peer-reviewed scientific controlled article that refutes the hypothesis of Dr. Cook. When you're looking at these things, you also need to be able to understand some of the science that's being put out there. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to be able to understand all of the jargon that's used. And I know a lot of people don't even bother reading any of these. A lot of scientific terms, and it's a hard slog for a non-scientist. Okay, but basically, this is how the research was set up. Okay. They took a group of 7 horses that met the criteria and that they needed. They did exercise on a high-speed treadmill. They did a free phase, which meant the horses were allowed to have their heads free to tilt them in whatever direction they needed. They ran those horses either with a snaffle bit and with a bitless bridle, both, okay, in different trials. And then they looked at the incidence of 2 different forms of dynamic laryngeal collapse. Okay, so that's basically what you're seeing here. Then they did a flexion phase where they actually flexed the horse's head, dropped their nose, all at the same angle, and measured the same things, both in a snaffle bit and in a bitless bridle. And they did assessments for mild, moderate, or severe amounts of these 2 forms of dynamic laryngeal collapse. Here's what they found. When a horse was allowed to hold their head the way a horse wants to hold its head, if it was free, none of the 7 horses had dynamic laryngeal collapse, regardless of whether they were wearing a bit or were in a bitless bridle. When the horses' heads were flexed, dynamic laryngeal collapse occurred in all of the horses, whether they were wearing a snaffle bit or a bitless bridle. And the pressure that was developed on inspiration between the snaffle bit bridle and the bitless bridle was measured, and it was scientifically, it was not different at all. So the suction forces that a horse has to use were no different depending on whether they had a bit in their mouth or did not have a bit in their mouth. So that's the idea behind the bitless bridle. And the next time you hear people saying something about the use of bits in horses and it causes them to suffocate, hopefully now you will know that there is a piece of research out there that refutes that. So I want to move on to some of the other things that you see very often in the horse industry. Hopefully I can get this done in a fast period of time so we're not here too long. Okay, what do we know about boots and bandages in horses? Because if you do any kind of competition in horses, it's rampant. It's something that every horseman believes that they need. So in order to understand this, you have to know how tendons essentially work. They're essentially large elastic bands. They store and release energy with each stride. So the back of a horse's leg has a deep and superficial flexor tendon and a suspensory ligament. When the hoof lands, it hits the ground, it slides forward, it stops. And then the weight of the horse comes down on their leg. The fetlock joint flexes. The flexor tendons and the suspensory ligaments stretch, okay? When the horse's body weight moves forward and the horse is in the propulsion phase, getting ready to lift their leg off the ground, it is helped by elastic recoil of the flexor tendons and the suspensory ligament. So that actually helps to lift the leg and help propel it forward. Actually, the horse's biomechanics is absolutely amazing in their lower leg. So lots and lots and lots of products out there. Very, very little proof of them being able to work. If you look at some of the science behind it, the superficial flexor tendon bears about 2,500 pounds of pressure applied within a millisecond during the time when that leg is loaded and the fetlock flexes towards the ground. Now, rationally think about anything man-made. Can you support that and hold it up by strapping something around it and still let the leg work the way it's supposed to work? Those supports are going to have to be really tight or very rigid to work. Measured under certain boots or bandages while horses were standing or cantering, and when that horse became fatigued, meaning that the fetlock flexes more towards the ground, those pressures became worse. And if you have to put these on really tight, are you constricting blood flow? Are you creating pressure points? Are you reducing the horse's range of motion? Are you simply transferring the strain from one area of the horse's legs to another to create even more problems? None of this research has been done. If you look at the pendulum effect of horse legs, there's very little weight on the bottom of the horse leg, and is by contracting the muscles either in the forearm or the thigh. So the lower part of the leg moves pretty much passively as a pendulum. If you add weight to the end of a pendulum, it changes the energy or force required to move that pendulum. So any amount of weight, be it boots or horses' shoes or whatever, compound the problem. And if the bandages get wet bandages can even double their weight, okay? And then when you get ones that have hard plastic or metal strike plates over the back to protect tendons, or even over the front for jumping boots or something like that, to protect the horse against cutting, those things can transmit concussion into soft tissues. Most of us have probably mistakenly been holding on to something metallic and had that hit something and the concussion goes straight up your arm. Okay. Here's what we do know. A lot of that stuff has not been proven. We do know about heat transfer in tendons. When a horse is running, they have repeated stretching of those tendons and ligaments. And anytime you stretch something like that, it's going to generate heat. And it generates heat up to 113 degrees during galloping. Now, in the lab, when you take tendon cells and expose them to that level or a little bit higher level of heat in vitro for 10 minutes, it kills the tendon cells. When the tendon cells die, they release inflammatory mediators that attack other tendon cells and further damage it. And what we do know is there's been a number of studies that show that legs under boots and wraps got significantly hotter than bare legs. And they reach temperatures that have been known to kill tendon cells in vitro in a petri dish. They never looked at it in a real life horse. So this is a thermogram showing a horse with eventing boots on and the amount of heat that is generated at the removal of those boots after exercise. The research has been going on for over 25 years, questioning whether the heat accumulated under boots actually contributes to tendon injuries or protecting it. So it's something that you need to put in the back of your brains when people convince you that you have to strap something to the bottom of horses' legs in order to protect them when they're exercising. Here's a relatively new product. It's a compression sock, and they have them for whole bodies too. We'll talk about that in a minute. The idea behind this is that it provides pressure from that gradient pressure that starts at the bottom of the horse's leg and is highest at the bottom and works its way up to the top. So basically the idea is it moves things up the horse's legs, okay? There's lots of different claims for what these compression socks are capable of doing, and I'm not going to go into all of it. One of the ones that's easiest to refute is it supposedly speeds up recovery time for muscles and soft injuries, tissue injuries, and soreness. These are compression boots. They are designed to go on the lower legs of the horse. Horses do not possess muscles in their lower legs. They only have tendons, ligaments, and bones. So if they're there to help with recovery of muscle soreness and injuries, they're being put on the wrong part of the horse's body. Okay. And yes, there is compression suits for entire horses. The idea is that one of the ideas for why they are useful is that they minimize muscle fatigue, soreness, by helping to remove lactic acid and therefore lowering the likelihood of tying up. None of these compression appliances have been studied in the horse. They've been studied in humans because if you watch the Olympics or any human athletics, you will find people that are wearing various compression appliances, okay? There's been a lot of human studies. A few of them have indicated improved lactic acid clearance. Lactic acid causes fatigue. But there are other reports that there is no effect on lactic acid. As far as the tying up idea is, tying up, the research has been known for over 20 years. There's tons of research that have conclusively shown that equine tying up is in no way related to lactic acid accumulation. So this idea has been defunct for a very long time. Now, intermittent tying up has been reported to occur secondary to overheating, okay? So my premise is, if we've just proved or shown that exercise boots can cause heat buildup in the lower leg, what is a full coverage bodysuit going to do for heat retention and dissipation? And again, there are no studies that have looked at this in horses. Another claim is that it increases blood circulation, allowing more red and white blood cells, oxygen, vitamins, minerals to reach each muscle, blah, 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 blah. Most recent research in human athletes reports no increase, sometimes an actual decrease in muscular blood flow using compression during and after exercise. It's not at all been studied in horses. So if you have a spare $600 or $700 or more dollars and you want to buy a compression suit for your horse in whatever color or pattern you want, that's fine. Just buy it as a piece of clothing and as a statement, but don't expect it to do anything and you won't be disappointed. Here's another product, and the question is there a solution looking for a problem? Again, these are UV filtering visors for horses. The claim is that extreme photophobia from visual spectrum light sensitivity, that it protects from it. There's no data about this in the research record. The claim is that cataracts are more prevalent in horses who are sensitive to light. There's no data in the research record. to indicate that. Some forms of head shaking can be helped with masks that limit light, and that's absolutely true. And horses that have equine recurrent uveitis are more sensitive to UV light, and that is true as well. So there are some legitimate reasons why you might consider dropping several $100s for visors for your horse. Okay. Understand that horses have a very good set of inborn sunglasses. This is the corpora nigra of the horse's eye. It's this ragged black thing projecting above and below the pupil in the horse's eye. The superior corpora nigra functions as an awning to shield polarized light, and the bottom one probably shields reflected light coming up off of the ground. The horse also has a horizontally slit pupil. Horizontally slit pupils are capable of much greater contraction than our own round pupils in response to bright light. Okay. Remember, horses evolved on the edge of glaciers. Glaciers mean sun. Sunlight means snow, sorry. Sunlight on snow is very bright and glaring. So they developed these things to cope with it. Senile cataracts develop slowly in horses. They think that it's caused by oxidation, but there's no research on that. And cataracts in younger adult horses are rare and usually caused by inflammation. So Dr. Marlin, who does a lot of this debunking stuff, actually took a bunch of these masks and measured how much UV reduction was claimed versus how much they actually measured. I'm just saying that if you are going out shopping, then the claims may be very different from the reality. Is because mask number 2 actually blocked more UV rays than they claimed that they blocked. We're getting a little bit late, but I want to go through this one thing here. Misinformation about the 2 biggies, wounds and colic. And this is working on good intentions when that meets misinformation, marketing, and mom. I don't really have a lot of time to go through the way that a horse or a human or any other animal heals, but basically what's happening here is they have ways to stop the bleeding, then to produce inflammation and take the contaminants out of the wound, and to bring in white blood cells to fight infection. Then they will stimulate the regrowth of tissue, which is called granulation, and the regrowth of skin over the top, which is called epithelialization. And finally, once a scar is made, there's a long remodeling period where that scar continues to shrink and get stronger and remodel. So here's the idea behind a wound and how it heals. And you have to go through this to understand how we screw this up, okay? Whenever an animal has a deep wound, okay, the first thing that happens after the bleeding has stopped is a process called angiogenesis. All that means is that blood vessels infiltrate that area, and you have to have capillaries and blood vessels to be able to deliver the products of healing to that particular area. So if you actually look at a wound, you will see this angry, bright red, velvety appearance, and that is actually a whole bunch of capillaries that are in the wound bed, and they're there for a reason. They deliver granulation tissue, which is basically collagen and fibroblasts, healing tissue. At the same time, different tissue, epithelial tissue, skin tissue, will migrate as a little tongue from the edge of the wound and start migrating across the top of the wound as it fills in from the bottom. The goal is for this to meet at the same time that the granulation gets to the surface, okay? Essential to this whole process is moisture and oxygen. So what people will tell you is take off the bandage and let the air get to it, okay? Let's look at that. Okay? If you have a wound that has an oxygen permeable bandage on it, there's moisture within that wound, and that moisture allows those epithelial cells to slide easily along the surface of that wound and reestablish, close it up, reestablish the skin. If you dry that wound out, what's going to happen is the dermis, the top layer of skin, dries and you create a scab. That's fine, but realize that the scab goes pretty deep and it actually impedes the movement of those epithelial cells across the surface of the wound. Instead of coming straight across on a bandage wound, they have to duck down underneath the scab and move along. So actually a wound that is exposed to the air heals more slowly than one beneath an oxygen permeable bandage. So take home message, cover it, leave it covered. Mom was wrong. Sorry, Mom. If I could eliminate one thing from the first aid kit of horse people, it would be hydrogen peroxide, okay? Take it back into your house and use it to whiten your teeth, but do not use it on wounds. The fizzing action of hydrogen peroxide is actually an oxidation reaction. We eat antioxidants to prevent tissue damage. Why would we intentionally want to create oxidation within a wound? Okay? Oxidation damages those fragile epithelial cells that are trying to close in on the top of a wound. So get rid of your hydrogen peroxide. It has actually been shown to slow the healing process and possibly even worsen the scar because it kills healthy cells. Furazone has been taken off the horse market. It's a carcinogen, but also it impedes epithelialization. So it actually slows wound healing. I feel bad because I used to use this goop all the time decades ago on horses, not realizing that I was doing them harm instead of good. So the take-home message when you're taking care of horses and first aid, and you've already had a first aid lecture anyway, is don't put anything in a wound that you wouldn't put in your own eye. Which brings up the idea of the dreaded proud flesh in horses, which is just a good thing, granulation tissue gone wild. Okay, if you understand the healing process now, what has happened with proud flesh is that granulation tissue, that healing tissue that's filling up from the base of the wound to the surface, overgrows the surface of the wound, and the epithelial cells don't have a chance to close over the top. So you have this angry, bubbly, pink, very vascularized tissue that whenever you bump it, it bleeds and everything, and it never really heals. Exuberant granulation tissue, proud flesh, occurs on the lower legs of the horse. We won't get into the reason why, but you don't have to worry about it in other parts of the horse. It's the lower legs. It has to do with hydrostatic pressure and the amount of circulation to the area. And it's caused by excessive stimulation of this granulation bed. That stimulation can be caused by inflammation because there's contaminants in the wound, from motion because it's in a joint and it's constantly moving, or by physical stimulation. You keep washing out that wound and scrubbing it. That stimulates it, okay? And also from lack of oxygen. So follow the ABCs. Get the advice of a professional, get it inspected, make sure that it is decontaminated, use an oxygen permeable bandage and keep it covered. If the professional says to use corticosteroids, you use them once. Steroids themselves, basically what they're going to do is they inhibit or slow down the granulation process, but they do not affect at all the epithelialization process. So basically, if you're adding corticosteroids to a wound, you're slowing this down and giving a chance for the skin to grow over the top of it. If you already have proud flesh, debridement, physically cutting that off and starting over again works better than caustics. Okay. And there's a plethora of things that you can choose on the horse market to make things worse. They're caustics. They dissolve granulation tissue. Okay. They are meant to be used on proud flesh after proud flesh has developed to dissolve that extra tissue. They are not meant to be put into a healing wound, although they are advertised many times as such. Caustic agents induce cell death, decomposition, they stimulate inflammation, they damage those new epithelial cells that are trying to close over the top, and ultimately they're going to inhibit healing. That's next to hydrogen peroxide. Caustics would be the next thing that I would take off of the horse market and not ever allow people to even buy. So read your labels carefully, and very often whatever is in it that makes it caustic is cleverly disguised. And finally, I just want to go through colic myths really quickly. Here are some of the myths that you hear. Horses tend to colic because the weather changes. And even if they did, what could you do about that? Horses twist their intestines when they roll. Horses try to alleviate the pain of colic by rolling, but the twist comes first, not the other way around. If horses got colic from rolling, any horse that went out after you just gave it a bath would get colic. Or what? If a horse is relatively comfortable laying down, leave it there. There's no reason to get them up and walk. The only reason would be if they've got a lot of accumulated gas, sometimes jostling it around will help move things along. There's another one, Banamine. That Banamine is a potent pain reliever for horses with colic, and this is the thing that comes as a surprise to most horse people, because either they have Banamine that they have gotten from the veterinarian, or that's the first thing that over the telephone the vet says to administer. But there is abundance of clinical research that's shown that Banamine is not very effective in treating colic pain. Okay, it's not a miracle drug. The other idea is horses with colic, if it's an impaction colic, you have to use oil. Okay, very conclusive research here. Horses need fluid when they're impacted, not lubrication. If you put a ball of manure in a jar of mineral oil, it just sits there. If you put a ball of manure in water, it falls apart. And also that there are supplements out there that can prevent colic and act as a digestive aid. We haven't found any yet scientifically. What we have found is turn your horses out, let them eat and move around like a horse, and that works best to prevent colic. I'm not going to go into all of this stuff, but you all know that there's a plethora of stuff out there that you can spend your money on with horses. What you need to know is that, nutritional supplements, nutraceuticals, none of them are under the purview of the FDA. They have never been tested. They are not quality control monitored. Legally, no health claims can be made on the label, although they are. So you have no way of knowing A, what's in there, B, whether it works, unless you do a vast amount of homework. I've done my research all the time. All I did was Google horse nutritional supplements. This is the first page that I got. There's like 10 out of these 102 products on the first page, that's not trying to sell you something. That's actually trying to educate you a little bit. So start looking at the URLs and determine whether there's a profit motive involved with this stuff that is being claimed to solve your problem. And lastly, where are you relying on your information? Okay, here are a group of some research that has been done that actually did surveys on where horse people get their information, and sadly, over 90% of them here are from like either the internet or advertisements. The other biggie is for nutritional information, they're asking their vet. Do you guys realize that there are very few vet schools that require any nutrition classes of their vets at all? Most of them have not one class dedicated solely to nutrition. Nutrition is sprinkled into several different classes, but vets are not nutritionists. Also, survey of perceptions. Here's one of the things. Here is the word. Horse people don't like, no, I take that back. People don't like to read. So if it's a short article in print or online, they may read it. But from this researcher, here's the sad one for me. Research reports online and in print are not being referred to something. So here we've got all of this information out there, all of these products that are searching for a buyer, and people that are getting their information from less reliable sources. And here's what they believe. They believe that supplement effectiveness has been well researched. Most of them are believing that the effectiveness, yeah, maybe not. And the safety, yeah, they believe. This is strongly agree to strongly disagree. They're not convinced that they're effective or safe, and yet they're buying them anyway. Okay. Here's my last one that you can just read. Category of folklore. It's believed that blue-eyed horses have eye problems. And they actually have done research comparing blue and brown-eyed horses. There's no difference. So if your horse has blue eyes, that doesn't mean it's inherently weaker, and you can enjoy your blue-eyed horse without worrying that you're going to have any kind of ocular problems, and that includes sensitivity to light. Blue-eyed horses do have a significantly greater chance of getting squamous cell carcinoma, cancer, around their eye in the skin, but that's because there's white pigmentation usually around the eye of blue-eyed horses. Okay, not going to get into that. So in summary, basically, don't contribute to the false information of the echo chamber. Check your information before you hit the share button. How do you check the information? A lot of people don't know where to go. And I'm going to give this particular slide separately to Jenny so that she can distribute it to you guys. But whoopsies, sorry, I hit it. For academic or scientific information, here are good sites that you can go to that compile all of these research papers. So you can use some keywords or phrases, and it should come up in Google Scholar, not Google, Google Scholar, PubMed, Sightseer. Those are the three that I use most of the time, okay? If you're looking for non-technical information, checking out social media posts, I always consult more than one source. But out of all of these fact-checking sites here, these are that you can go to, these are the ones that I consider the most reliable. So I spent a lot of time, and I'm sorry I moved through things pretty quickly. Hopefully you're still with me and you have some questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Jenny now.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And does anyone have any questions for Dr. King?
Oh, look, we have 4 people now. Yay!
Yes. And we had several people join us afterwards, but they may just have done that to make sure that they get the link to it, because now that it's spring and a little warmer, everyone's trying to get outside with their.
Absolutely.
So, any questions? Well, I thank you so much. I am absolutely blown away by your slide on wraps and boots when riding and working your horse, because I think every single barn I've been in, every discipline I've seen, everyone always, and I was like, I don't do anything that strenuous with my horse when he was here. I mean, we walked, trotted. If I got super frisky, we might like canter down a wall, but he was also a Percheron, so we had a very long stride. So it was kind of like 3 steps and we were at the end. But I found that completely amazing that it raises the temperature to the point that it actually damages the cells.
Yeah.
So,
and like you said, every discipline has their favorite form of leg wrap, it seems like, but it's become the thing to do. It's like you actually get looked down upon if you exercise your horse and you're not protecting its legs, which is kind of sad and maybe counterproductive in actuality. So,
and the compression sleeves and the whole compression suit, first of all, I mean, with 18 hands and 1,800 pounds. So I didn't have to worry that they were going to make one that big. But I can't even imagine I can't imagine how you would get that on a horse.
And it's recommended, at least from the website of the company that's making these right now, it's recommended to use either before or after exercise, but not during, although on their website they show a bunch of pictures of horses being exercised with these things on, which scares the willies out of me.
Oh my goodness.
Since heat dissipation is so important in horses. But think about a sweaty horse and trying to put a compression suit on. That would be kind of like stepping out of the bathtub and putting on a pair of pantyhose before you towel off.
I was just thinking that. Like, on a good, dry, chilly day, it's a challenge with pantyhose. So, Karen does have a question here. And I don't know, Karen, you are absolutely welcome to unmute yourself. I think I've unmuted everybody from my end.
Yeah, I'll unmute now. I just figured it's easier to type it. I fixed all the typos. Actually, I have an elderly horse. He's an awesome horse. He's 29 now. In January, he tore halfway through his deep digital flexor tendon. And actually, we found the tear, and it's right where it crosses over the sesamoids. But what they had me do was to polo wrap the leg, and that surprised me because I'm a dressage person. We always polo wrapped, but it actually worked. I mean, when I would change it, I mean, the legs were definitely hotter, but it actually, and I'm actually going to hop on them today. I had a lighter weight person get on him initially, but he is doing awesome. He re-ultrasounded a week or so ago, and the tear is healed. The entire tendon isn't refilled, so we're just walking. I've been hand walking him to try to prevent adhesions and whatever. And he's doing really, really well. But I was surprised about the polo wrap because we always said, well, it can stop them from striking themselves. That's really the only purpose for polos. But that was what they wanted me to do, was to polo wrap. And we did both hinds to prevent the opposing limb from, because it's obviously been holding a lot more of the weight. But it seems to have worked really, really well. And it just surprised me. I did what the vet did, what they instructed, but I was shocked that worked. And I don't understand, especially because then it absolutely heated up the leg, and it happened in the winter time, so it was cold, so maybe the heat helped, but and if it happened in the summer, maybe there would have been a different treatment. But yeah, we went through, do we do the stumps? I mean, I'm not gonna, he says it'll heal, in time on its own anyhow, and I could do all the expensive, super modern stuff to do. He says, but they'll both heal in about the same amount of time. And he's doing good. He said it'll probably be another couple of months before we can try to trot, but he's getting along really well. He is the love of my life, and he loves to work, but he's doing well. And yeah, I'm actually going to get on him and ride him this afternoon, walking around. I got somebody there to make sure I don't get greedy. He likes to work. But why would a polo wrap adding heat that can destroy tendons be the treatment for getting one to fill in the tear? Any idea?
Okay, I'm going to speak as a scientist, okay? And just my area is physiology, okay? You've got to be careful when you make the assumption, yes, your horse healed, and congratulations, what a great horse. Horses have a phenomenal healing ability. I've seen some just wrecks that, 6 months later, you would never think that horse had been in the situation they had been in. So Mother Nature does wonders, as you have said. From a scientific point of view, the only way that you could conclusively prove that the polo wrap actually helped with the healing process is if you had identical lesions, God forbid, on both legs, and you didn't polo wrap one and you polo wrap the other, so that you can compare the time to healing. I guess the idea is the horse is going to heal, like the vet said. That horse is going to heal no matter what you do. The polo wrap may have trapped in some extra heat, which in that situation, bringing some heat to the area is probably good. You end up with a little bit more circulation. Circulation to the lower legs is notoriously bad. Okay, yeah. So that may have helped. Polo wraps don't help at all with support. So it's not like it prevented that torn tendon from re-tearing if the horse stepped on it or something like that. It probably acted as protection and possibly produced some heat in that area that would help with the healing process. That's my supposition. And like you said, in the end, the horse is healing, and that's wonderful. Scientifically, the only way that you can prove it is to have absolutely comparable injuries. And that's one of the big problems in the horse industry when you say, like you argue with people, for instance, with pin firing or bar firing, when a horse has a bow tendon, hopefully not a persistent practice, but it's still done on the racetrack, they actually burn the horse's skin straight through into their tendon with the idea that that's going to stimulate healing. which it's been conclusively proven that it hasn't. But in order to prove it, you have to create exactly the same problem in one leg compared to the other. Fire the left leg and don't fire the right leg. It's really hard to justify that kind of research on a horse. So that's a long way of getting around. Congratulations on your old guy getting back to being able to be used.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thrilled. And I wanted to also thank you for talking about the covering a wound versus not covering. You know, I've done the experiment on myself. You know, you got a big long cut on your arm, you cover half of it and you don't cover the other half, and the covered half heals an awful lot faster.
A lot faster. Yep.
Absolutely. My husband and I just had this debate a couple weeks ago when I managed to cut myself pretty good on my leg. Thank you, vet wrap and some gauze for keeping it covered. And he was just adamant about the hydrogen peroxide and leaving it open. And I'm going to make him come back and watch the recording of this.
So I've had the hydrogen peroxide fight with a lot of people. And
yeah, it is.
Mostly people with themselves versus the horses. I don't know too many horse people that still use it, but people, I say get rid of the hydrogen peroxide.
Oh, the horse people use the caustic stuff. They just kill. Which, you know, they've changed the formulation of cut heel. It used to have turpentine in it.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
That's funny.
So is that, I know you and I chatted several years ago at Illinois Horse Fair because someone had recommended used motor oil for treating scratches.
Yeah.
And I have on my phone, I have a note saved about using WD-40 for anything. And when I see it on social media, I copy my note and paste it right in. And it is amazing how many people will double down on WD-40. And like, would you use it on yourself? Because I believe horse skin is actually thinner than our skin.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you wouldn't use it on yourself, why are you using it on your horse when there's literally 4 aisles of hair care product that you could use to detangle and get the knots out, and, you know, another aisle of cooking oil if you really don't want to, you know, spend the 99 cents on the swab. So pervasive.
And then the horse industry tends to go through waves, if you've noticed. You know, something catches on for whatever reason, and it circulates amongst a whole generation of horse people. And once you have, like what you had said, you get confirmation bias. And, you know, you've memorized it. You believe in your heart of hearts that this is true, even if it's not. And you are resistant to listening to somebody tell you that it's horse hockey because you've got confirmation bias. It's a human trait. It's what we do.
Oh my goodness. It never ceases to amaze me. I'm like, go in your house and get whatever you use on your hair. It's gonna be better. And honestly, knots are just all about patience and time.
Yeah, with the wound stuff, it was, I thought of, I don't know if you ever watched My Big Greek Wedding, I think was the name of the movie, with the guy with the Windex. And I immediately, when I saw that, I thought of horse people. They pick their favorite product, whatever it is, and it's like their Windex.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. The other question I have is, sometimes when I have listened, I'm a little bit of an equine nutrition nerd myself. So when I listen to different podcasts or articles, like you said, sometimes information is presented because people are trying to sell you something or steer you toward a product.
Mm-hmm.
How, and that wonderful slide you had up before, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. We'll make sure that gets in the discussion page for our event. But is it worth listening to equine nutritionists that may work for a specific feed company, or
Yeah, that's a
is
really
it
good question.
best to sort of use our discretion and try to find independent studies? And sometimes they may match and sometimes they may not. What is our best resource as, horse owners sitting here going, I just want to do what's best for my horse?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I am always skeptical of taking at face value what is being told to me by somebody who's trying to sell something to me. Okay. I just mentally put them in the category of a used car salesman and I take it with a grain of salt. With that, I think the more sources that you can consult, the better. Okay. And that's where you have to really start looking, if you're doing your search online, looking at the URLs that you're actually calling up. Because a lot of them, if you Google something or you use whatever search engine you're using, maybe the first 5 of them are actually related to one another. So you're reading the same thing over and over again in your brain. You think you're confirming the information when actually you're just reading a different version of the same person trying to sell you something. So you have to start getting good at working your way around the internet and understanding a little bit about the sources that you're using. So as many sources as you can possibly have. And, if you can find, in your case, a nutritionist that is not in the business, is in academia instead, that's the best way of going. But there aren't a whole heck of a lot of those.
No, well, I'm hoping my wonderful network, which includes you and other veterinarians I know, can steer me towards their colleagues that have stayed in academia and are doing research and can provide us with the scientifically proven and tested information to help us better feed our horses. So we are sharing Dr. King's contact information. As we mentioned, she is the current chair of the Best Horse Practices Summit, which I believe is in late October this year.
In Lexington.
Wonderful. So there is the website, her email address if you have specific questions, and I highly cannot recommend enough following her on Facebook. You should be able to follow her. If she's anything like me, which I think she is, friend requests tend to fall way down to the bottom of the list, but you can follow her for all her public posts, which are absolutely wonderful. And hers is one of the first pages I check every morning to see what we're talking about today. So I do have one more question. Every good podcast or webinar series has that signature question they ask all of their speakers. So what was your favorite horse book as a child?
Let me think. My favorite horse. I grew up in a very small town in Massachusetts, and I read every horse book in the public library, literally every single one that they had. I think my favorite back then, though, was probably Black Beauty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We're just kind of asking all of our speakers, and we'll put together sort of a fun little post for Reading Month and share the list with all of our young supporters and hopefully kindle their love of reading and therefore leading to 2 years of deep diving and feeding horses. So we do have, I do have one more question. Every good podcast or webinar series has that signature question they ask all of their speakers. So what was your favorite horse book as a child?
I
finding the good sources and the factual sources.
Hopefully so.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jenny.
And next month, our post is up in our Facebook group. We are going to be talking about barn fire prevention with Dr. Rebecca Jimenez Husted from Technical Large Animal Emergency Rescue. She is internationally recognized for her work in teaching first responders and veterinarians how to deal with horses that have slid off the trail, horses that are running loose, barn fires, trailer accidents. Specifically though, as we get to summer and we're plugging in all of our fans, which I hope are all closed motor fans. We don't use box fans in barns ever. Dr. Jimenez will be speaking with us about what we can do to prevent barn fires, which unfortunately have been happening just about as long as we've been putting animals in structures. So please hop over to our Facebook page, register for that. If you're not able to join us, register anyway, and we'll send you the link once we have recorded it. So I think we have one more chat. Oh, Karen says, similar to our scratches and used motor oil, a farrier had me use axle grease on a different horse of mine that all the vet concoctions failed on. The axle grease was the only thing that worked. So.
Well, it repels water. So if the goal is to keep it from
to keep water out, and I have in my optimistic nature, I have to believe that the formulations over the years have changed, just like, you know, we go buy the same shampoo or the same body wash or lotion, and then all of a sudden it's just not quite working right. And at some point before other things were developed, is it possible that this may have worked? But as formulas are tweaked and different compounds are discovered and added to things, was there ever possibly a kernel of truth in some of these recommendations? And just over the years, it's evolved to the point that it's actually become dangerous?
Good question, but I mean, I'm going back, you were talking about my Facebook posts, and I love looking back and using the horse historically. Back in the horse and wagon days, axle grease was lard.
So it wasn't
lard or bear fat. It was a neutral oil, basically, fat. So you're exactly right. It wasn't a petroleum-based product. It was a natural product. It had a lot of lubrication abilities, and it wouldn't have any contaminants in it because it had been rendered. So you might be onto something there.
It could have started out honestly, and
yeah,
as we evolve, so do our formulations, and now we're to the point where it's not. It is petroleum based, and it's not safe for use on living beings.
Right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We actually had, I believe, our first international visitor from Sweden.
Yeah, wasn't that great?
Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you will join us for future episodes. Everyone get out there and enjoy your horses. Thanks so much. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.